Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. Now, we're going to talk about Manchester's success on today's show and also to try to draw some lessons for other cities in the UK. Since at least the turn of the century, really, there's been a real momentum in Manchester. It has more students than any other city in Europe, and increasingly they stay on in the city rather than decamping to London, which is not something that was the case decades ago. And young professionals are buying into the appeal of big city life with a gentler pace in London and also a much cheaper cost of living, it should be said, especially amid the shift to flexible working. And there's been a lot of building in Manchester. More than 24 towers have gone up in central Manchester in the past 5 years, with another 20 under construction.
And the development shows up in the economic data. According to the consultancy EY, output in the city council areas forecast actually to grow by 2.2% in 2027. That's faster than London. Among the other accolades, Manchester's proving popular with big business. It's home to the regional headquarters for Amazon, for Klarna, and a lot of others. There's been a bit of criticism about the distribution of the new jobs, though, some people feeling left behind. And on a national level, does the city's new status increase the power of the devolved mayor, Andy Burnham? I mean, you've got to think how the Labour Prime Minister is going to interact now with 11 elected metro mayors, 10 of whom are Labour. What's that interplay going to be like?
Yeah, a real change to the local government scene. Well, let's discuss this with writer Julia Hobsbawm, who's penned a piece for Bloomberg City Labs called "Manchester is Giving London a Run for Its Money." Now, Julia, the story of Manchester's renaissance is nothing new, but just tell us what's the key to its success?
I really wanted to talk about Manchester as the poster child for cities that are pivoting to adjust to the new ways of living and working that knowledge workers in particular want. As you said in your introduction, Manchester's renaissance per se is not new. It's got the most famous football team in the world. It's known for its music scene, both classical and popular, its education and science, and its industry. But what I discovered was that it's really attracting young workers who want the affordability, the proximity to nature, and the sustainability that the building developments are offering, both offices that you can come into in a flexible way with lots of cafe space, lots of green space, and so on. So I found it absolutely fascinating to write this piece.
Do you think that Manchester, though, can thrive? I mean, when we think about the future of work, can it thrive as a kind of place where work from home jobs maybe are a big part of the appeal, and that is, as you were saying, you're in that kind of maybe gentler side of life, or maybe a better work-life balance?
My interest is how we live and work and the inequalities of that, actually. And so it must be said that Greater Manchester is the sixth poorest council in the UK, for example, as Manchester City Council. So there's a lot of poverty and a lot of inequality. And of course, when you think about jobs, absolutely not everybody can work hybrid. But that said, everybody wants to work flexibly. And in the UK, over 3/4 of companies now offer some form of location flexibility, or about half offer some kind of sustainable hybrid model. And so people do want, where they can, to live and work flexibly. And Manchester's infrastructure in transport in its inner city is also attracting people in. Andy Burnham, as you might expect, is a big political operator, and he's done a very good job in raising a lot of money centrally from Westminster to create something they call the B network of trams and buses. And so Manchester's on its way to becoming that thing that everybody talks about, the buzzword, no pun intended, talking about the B network, but the buzzword of being a 15-minute city. So it's not that Manchester doesn't have its inequalities, it does, but that for the knowledge worker, knowledge sector, tech sector type of worker, it's definitely got an edge at this point.
Yeah, and that was very much the message that Andy Burnham was talking to me and to others about when we were up for the Conservative Party conference last year, and I met Lou Caldwell, who's the chair of Greater Manchester's Business Board. I mean, they were very much trying to talk about, the fact that it's not just Burnham, but it's also all of the backing and really the united front that the business and the political community have in trying to attract that business into Manchester, which I think has also been, you talked about Burnham being a salesperson. I think that's really key, isn't it? In terms of attracting that investment into the city. I suppose, what do you think underlies that? They've got to be very good salespeople for themselves to get those big names, as I say, like Amazon and others to come.
Well, Manchester's always been the most flamboyant, self-proclaimed, self-promoting city, and not without good reason. It's got such rich history and a market lead that spans, as I say, industry, science, education, culture, and sport. So, but actually, you're right that the business community is pulling together, and I was partly in Manchester because I was invited by the Forum for the Built Environment to speak on a panel about the future of work, and I did so at an interesting development called the Eden Building that prides itself as having Europe's largest living wall of greenery. And I think what's interesting is that the business community is adapting, dare I say, very flexibly to the needs of tenants, residents, and so on. So, before the pandemic, of course, office space was rather a rigid model, the idea that you would commute in and stick it out for 8 hours a day. That isn't happening. And because Manchester has such a vibrant development building, so much is being repurposed anyway. The majority of buildings in Manchester that are being developed are not being built, but are being redeveloped. They have actually got a lot of flexibility to match the times and to make the buildings green and to put in flexible working space. And in fact, there are a lot of flexible working businesses in Manchester. And that was another piece of information I didn't really have when I started visiting a lot and thinking and writing about this subject.
I have to admit to being a bit of a Manchester fanboy. I lived there for a few years not so long ago, and I think it's a great city. But having declared that interest, I'm interested to know why Manchester? What are they doing that's different? Because there's no reason on paper that Birmingham shouldn't be doing this. Birmingham was a thriving city, a very wealthy part of England many years ago, and it's part of a wider economic zone. The West Midlands, like Manchester, is part of Greater Manchester. So on paper, it should be doing just as well, but it isn't, is it?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I do think that Birmingham has an edge, so does Edinburgh. You can say pretty much without qualification that Manchester's the first industrial city. You can't quite say it is the second city. It's the second most populous city, but it's got that pizzazz. It's got the edge. Interestingly, both my stepchildren, who are in their 30s, spontaneously said at the weekend that they had friends that were moving to Manchester, that it had crossed their mind to move from London to Manchester, and they didn't even know about this piece. It hadn't been published yet. I thought that was interesting. So why is Manchester in the zeitgeist? I think it's because there is a sort of perfect alignment of a lot of factors. One of them is this shift to work-life balance. The second is the cost of living crisis has been so ruinous for people. So I interviewed the award-winning writer Ed Caesar, who moved with his barrister wife, who works on the Northern Circuit and the London Circuit, to Manchester 10 years ago. And he said there were really 3 reasons. One was good schools and a good place to build a family from. The second was the proximity to international transport links. And the third, he said, was it's just kind of cool and edgy. And there's no doubt about it that cities have got to appear to be sexy. And Manchester is right now.
Yeah, lots of influencers based in Manchester as well. I'm reliably informed, adding to that sense of glamour, as you say. I'm also interested. Maybe your stepchildren also are perhaps into influencers as well. In terms of though, the politics of this. Let's bring it back to that. I mean, I mentioned that all of those Metro mayors are now Labour mayors, and they're very much embedded, aren't they, those elected Metro mayors? And so I have also been wondering, ahead of the budget in October, what the relationship is going to look like between these Labour mayors and the Labour government that wants to build and bring back growth to Britain. How do you think that is going to sort of work together? I mean, what are also the strands that you've picked out of Labour policy on the future of work, on this idea of hybrid working and attracting inward investment?
Well, you raise a very good point. I mean, going back to the question about what gives Manchester its edge, I mean, actually, Andy Burnham does. Andy Burnham being the mayor of Manchester, the 3 times elected mayor of Manchester, he's almost not put a foot wrong. There was a bit of a blip reported actually by Manchester Mill, the hyperlocal media, about perhaps he was too close to one of his advisors who was apparently allegedly in receipt of funds that he shouldn't have been. But other than that, he's really had a blameless life as Manchester mayor, and he is very much part of the appeal of it. Look, regionalism is gaining in strength and advocacy, and actually Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, another Metro mayor, co-wrote a book that I cite in the piece about the North. And there is absolutely, it's a book called Head North, a rallying cry for a more equal Britain. Not Birmingham. Forgive me. Steve Rotherham, of course, is the Metropolitan Mayor of Liverpool. And there is absolutely no doubt that there is a political move towards regionalism. And there's no doubt at all that Andy Burnham is central to the story of that shift to regionalism. He is a superstar Metropolitan Mayor for sure. He's 3 times elected. He's almost never put a foot wrong. And I think that is going to play a big part. The house building point is a big part of it. Manchester has been very busy building apartments in part of its redevelopments. The final point I would make is that I do believe that we are entering an era of flexible working being a dominant feature of the working landscape. And any city that pitches to that and can cater for that in transport, in culture, in work-life balance is a city that's going to do well. Now, London will always have the total edge because it's the capital city, but unless it gets its cost of living under control, its transport and infrastructure better under control, cities like Manchester will capitalise on that, and they're already doing so.
Julia, great to get your thoughts. Julia Hobsbawm, who's written for Bloomberg City Labs today, an interesting piece about Manchester. Of course, the danger for Manchester is that the things that have been so pivotal in its success, the cheap rents, the fact that young people move there because they have a better standard of living. Of course, with lots of economic growth, the danger is, of course, it becomes more and more like London.
Yeah, and complaints about rising rents are becoming more evident even in Manchester, although they're obviously significantly cheaper than, let's say, the southeast of England. But that could be a spanner in the works. But a fascinating deep dive into one of the key cities in the UK. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This
episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Costamacchio. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker, and we'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.